The trial was supposed to break her. Everyone expected her to shatter. The onlookers anticipated weeping, begging, the pitiful collapse of a wolfless mate who had dared to dream above her station. But Iris Vance did not cry. She did not beg. She stood perfectly still in the dead center of the grand courtroom of the Northern Keep, the absolute focus of 100 hostile stares. The ancient stone floor radiated a bone-deep chill through the thin soles of her leather boots, attempting to drag her internal temperature down to match the freezing hostility of the room. The grand courtroom was a cavern of ruthless ambition, its towering arched ceilings trapping the scent of stale wine, nervous sweat, and the sharp coppery tang of impending violence. The gathered nobles watched her with the hungry, unblinking stares of a wolf pack circling a wounded deer. She refused to shiver. Her spine remained straight. It was a flawless line of quiet, defiant dignity. Wrapped securely around her shoulders was the heavy, impenetrable bulk of her ancestral silver-furred cloak. The sacred garment was thick enough to ward off the lethal high mountain blizzards, but today its true purpose was far more vital. Beneath the heavy folds of silver fur, her hands rested protectively over her lower abdomen. She was carrying the king's heirs. She had known for exactly 3 days, and now she was going to die here, or be cast out to the wolves. The evidence is incontrovertible, my king. A voice slithered through the cavernous space. Vandred Thorn stepped into the sliver of pale winter light cutting through the high Gothic windows. The senior counselor possessed a face that was sharp and beautiful, but only in the way a fatal winter frost was beautiful. There was no warmth in his pale eyes. There was only the predatory calculation of a man who had finally trapped his prey. He held up a thick, leather-bound stack of parchment, the espionage ledgers. The very air around the pages seemed to warp with dark, malicious intent. "These documents bear the exact magical signature of your mate," the counselor continued, his tone dripping with a polite, poisoned honey that made Iris's stomach turn. They contain detailed geographical weaknesses of the eastern border. Troop movements, hidden silver reserves, patrol schedules, information sold directly to the rival empire. It was a lie. It was a flawless, meticulously orchestrated fabrication. Iris did not waste her breath denying it. She had already spoken her truth hours ago, when the trial first began, and the words had fallen on deaf ears. The council had wanted her gone since the day the sovereign had placed the lunar crown on her unremarkable head. She was a commoner. She had no wolf. She was a biological anomaly in a court that prized feral dominance, and they had finally found the perfect forgery to sever her from the throne. Her gaze shifted upward, bypassing the smug matriarchs and the sneering noblemen, to the raised dais at the end of the hall, to him. Eric Sterling sat upon the throne of black iron. He looked like a god carved from granite and storm clouds. The Alpha King possessed a terrifying physical presence, a sheer mass of lethal muscle and ancient authority that usually forced the air out of the lungs of anyone who stepped within 50 paces. But today, the king was suffocating on his own power. He was fighting his inner beast. Iris could see it in the microscopic tremors of his massive shoulders. She could read the desperate, agonizing war raging beneath his skin. His massive hands gripped the iron armrests of the throne so tightly that the metal groaned in protest. His knuckles were bone-white. His breathing was shallow, jagged, fighting the primal instinct to leap from the dais, slaughter the entire council, and drag his fated mate into the dark sanctuary of his private chambers. But he was a king before he was a mate, and the law of the mountain fortress was absolute. Treason demanded a response. The mating mark on her left collarbone pulsed. A sudden, sharp spike of burning agony flared beneath her skin as Eric's storm-grey eyes finally met hers. The sacred thread woven between their souls stretched, tore, and bled phantom heat. He was in agony. He believed the ledgers. The forgery was so perfect, the dark magic woven into the false ink so complete, that it had tricked even the sovereign's heightened senses. Deny the charges. His eyes begged her across the silent expanse of the courtroom. Give me a reason to tear this room apart. She looked at the man she loved, the man whose touch carried a heavy, burning gold warmth that had once been her only refuge in this hostile castle. She offered him nothing. Her wolf whimpered in the deep, dark recesses of her mind, thrashing against the agonizing reality of the severed bond, but the human woman reigned supreme. If she pleaded, if she shouted her innocence, they would strip her of her dignity. Worse, they would drag her forward. They would subject her to the magical inquisitors. They would strip her of her heavy cloak to search for hidden artifacts, and in doing so, they would discover the tiny, fragile sparks of twin life glowing in her womb. If Vandred knew she carried the royal bloodline, the babies would not survive the night. So Iris pulled the silver fur tighter around her throat. She locked her knees. She kept her hands pressed flat against her stomach. It was a silent, invisible shield of maternal fury standing between her unborn children and the teeth of the world. The law requires judgment, sovereign, Vandred pressed, stepping closer to the dais. He placed the forged documents on the lowest step, a theatrical display of submission. The pact demands the safety of the borders. A traitor cannot wear the lunar crown, no matter how deeply the fated bond attempts to blind our alpha. The heavy silence stretched. It was a suffocating, ozone-heavy pressure. The ambient temperature in the hall seemed to plummet further. Spidery patterns of frost began to creep up the high stone pillars, a physical manifestation of the Alpha's fracturing control. Eric slowly rose from the throne. The sheer size of the man blotted out the light from the stained glass behind him. He descended the 3 stone steps with the heavy, measured tread of an executioner. Every step sent a reverberating tremor through the floorboards. The crowd parted instantly, backing away in primal fear, lowering their heads to expose their throats. Only the accused woman remained standing tall. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of her. The scent of him, burning gold, cedar, and the sharp bite of a looming thunderstorm, washed over her in a suffocating wave. The physical proximity was absolute torture. Every biological instinct she possessed commanded her to close the gap, to press her face into the crook of his neck, to inhale his scent and let him protect her. Instead, she lifted her chin. He stared down at her. His piercing gaze was a violent, swirling vortex of betrayal, duty, and an agonizing, unspoken grief. A muscle feathered along his sharp jawline. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest rising and falling in erratic, jerky motions. He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for the quiet, gentle woman who had spent years warming his bed and untangling his nightmares to drop to her knees and explain how this was all a terrible mistake. "Did you do it?" he asked. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that bypassed her ears and vibrated directly against her ribcage. It was not the voice of her lover. It was the voice of a sovereign cornered by his own laws. "I have spoken my truth, my king," she replied. Her voice was perfectly steady. It did not tremble. It did not waver. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, cold, flat, and entirely uncompromising. Eric flinched. The micro-expression was so fast. No one else in the room could have caught it. But she knew the topography of his face better than she knew her own reflection. The formal title was a physical blow to his chest. "The ledgers bear your scent." The king ground out, taking a half-step closer. The heat radiating off his massive body battled the freezing air of the hall. "They bear your magical signature. The forged seal is undeniable, Iris. Offer me something. Grant me a single word to justify burning those papers. Confess to him that he is a father." A small, desperate voice whispered in her mind. "Tell him the council is attempting to murder his heirs." She almost did. The words rose in her throat, thick and heavy with panic. But then her peripheral vision caught the slight, satisfied twitch at the corner of Vandred's mouth. The counselor was watching her stomach. He was watching the way she held the cloak. They knew she was hiding something. They just did not know what it was yet. If she revealed the pregnancy now, she would become a prisoner of the state. She would be locked in the high tower for her own protection until the pups were born. And then they would be taken from her. The council would raise them to be monsters, and she would be quietly disposed of in the night. She could not trust a king who required proof of her loyalty over the absolute truth of their instinctual bond. "I have nothing else to offer you," the wolfless mate said softly. Eric stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The storm in his eyes slowly died, freezing over into a bleak, desolate winter. The man she loved vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. He left only the terrifying, isolated monarch behind. He turned his back on her. "Bring it," the Alpha King commanded. A scribe scurried forward from the shadows, terrified, clutching a heavy wooden tray. On it rested a thick roll of parchment, an inkwell carved from obsidian, and a quill, the Sovereign Exile Decree. The absolute finality of the object seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. This was not a banishment to the dungeons. This was the severing of a pack member from the protective wards of the territory. In the dead of winter, for a woman without a wolf to shift into for warmth, it was a death sentence. Eric did not hesitate. He could not afford to, not with the entire political structure of the realm, watching his every move, waiting for weakness. He reached out with a massive, scarred hand and took the quill. The scratching of the metal nib against the rough parchment was the loudest sound in the world. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings like a gavel striking a tombstone. It sounded like bones breaking. It sounded like the tearing of flesh. To Iris, every stroke of the dark black ink was a physical blade carving into her chest, carving away the safety she had known for the past 3 years. The fated mating mark on her collarbone flared from a dull throb to a blinding, agonizing burn. She clamped her teeth together, so hard she tasted copper. The physical agony of a soul bond being legally and magically suppressed was indescribable. It felt as though a hot iron hook had been buried in her chest and was being slowly cranked backward, pulling her internal organs toward the door. She did not gasp. She did not fall. The king dropped the quill. It clattered against the wooden tray. A royal guard stepped forward, melting red wax over the bottom of the parchment. Eric pressed his heavy iron signet ring into the hot wax. Crack! The sound of the seal breaking away from the hardened wax finalized the doom. By the ancient laws of the Northern Keep, the king's voice boomed, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. It was empty, hollow. Iris Vance is hereby stripped of the lunar crown. She is stripped of pack protection, of name, and of sanctuary. She is banished to the outer wilds. Should she cross the territorial borders again, her life is forfeit. He handed the heavy, rolled parchment to the captain of the guard, but his eyes returned to her. "You have until sundown to leave the valley," he said quietly. Only for her. Sundown was in less than an hour. The blizzard raging outside the thick glass windows was already howling, battering against the stone walls with elemental fury. The courtroom waited in breathless anticipation. This was the moment the arrogant commoner would finally break. She would fall to the stone. She would wail. She would grab the hem of the king's dark cloak and beg for the warmth of the dungeons over the freezing oblivion of the woods. Iris stepped back. She lifted the hem of her heavy dress with one hand, keeping the other firmly pressed against the secret, hidden beneath the silver fur. She crossed her right leg behind her left. She lowered her body into a flawless, perfectly executed deep royal curtsy. "As my king commands," she whispered. The words were soft, but they carried to every corner of the silent hall. When she rose, she did not look at Eric Sterling again. She pivoted on her heel. The heavy fabric of the ancestral silver-furred cloak flared out behind her like a shield. She began the long, agonizing walk down the central aisle toward the massive oak doors of the keep. Every step was a battle against the tearing biological pain of the severed bond. Every step felt like walking through deep, freezing mud, the faces of the nobles blurred in her periphery, sneering, triumphant, disgusted. She ignored them all. Her focus narrowed to a singular point. The heavy iron latch of the front doors. Behind her, the silence of the throne room was absolute. It was an iron silence. It was the silence of a kingdom that had just watched its sovereign tear out his own heart and hand it to his enemies on a silver platter. She reached the massive door. The royal guards stationed there hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsettled by the unnatural calm of the banished woman, before leaning their massive weight against the wood. The doors groaned. The iron hinges shrieked. The moment the seal was broken, the violent reality of the outside world exploded into the keep. A massive blast of freezing air, thick with blinding white snow, rushed inward. The brutal, icy gale slapped her across the face, and the hot, bleeding phantom wound of her severed mating mark instantly crystallized, freezing over into a jagged block of ice beneath her collarbone. The brutal temperature shift sent a violent, agonizing spasm through her nervous system. The physical shock of the blazing heat turning to dead, numbing frost stole the breath from her lungs, but she refused to falter. She stepped over the threshold. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the golden light and the stifling heat of the castle. The boom of the wood settling into the stone frame was the sound of a tomb closing. Iris stood alone on the upper courtyard stones. The wind howled around her, vicious and unyielding, tearing at her hair and whipping the heavy cloak around her legs. The cold began to seep through the seams of her boots immediately, biting at her toes, warning her of the lethal journey ahead. She had no provisions. She had no escort. She had only the clothes on her back and the deep, ancient blood running through her veins. She walked down the long, sweeping stone steps, away from the fortress that was supposed to be her forever home. By the time she reached the tree line at the edge of the valley, the keep was completely obscured by the heavy whiteout of the blizzard. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Her eyelashes were already freezing together. Her breath plumed in short, frantic white clouds before being snatched away by the gale. She stopped beside a massive, frost-covered pine tree. Her legs finally gave out. She sank into the deep snow, dropping to her knees. The physical agony of the bond separation hit her with full force, now that she was no longer being observed by 100 pairs of hostile eyes. She wrapped her freezing fingers into her family's thick mantle, bowing her head against the screaming gale. The phantom bleeding beneath her collarbone pulsed in time with her erratic heartbeat, a brutal reminder of the sovereign who had chosen duty over her life. But as a fresh wave of blinding cold washed over her, a small, stubborn spark of warmth bloomed in her lower abdomen. Her twins, his heirs, they were the only reason she had not let the ice claim her the moment the heavy oak doors sealed her fate. Iris squeezed her eyes shut, fighting past the tearing sensation in her soul, and forced herself back up. She would not die here in the frozen dirt. She was a mother now. The world of teeth and politics was behind her, and the silent, unforgiving sanctuary of the Whispering Peaks lay ahead. Pulling the heavy cloak tighter around her throat, she turned her back on the royal stronghold and stepped forward into the whiteout. The blizzard was a living, breathing beast. It clawed at her exposed skin, turning the moisture on her cheeks into microscopic shards of glass before she could even process the cold. Iris did not cry for the king. She walked blindly, driven purely by the sheer, blinding agony of the psychic shock radiating from her broken bond. She walked for hours, or maybe it was days. Time lost its meaning in the endless expanse of the deep woods. The world was nothing but white noise, freezing wind, and the excruciating, rhythmic burning beneath her collarbone. Her legs moved mechanically, one foot, then the other. When she finally collapsed for the second and final time, she did not have the strength to get up. The snow embraced her, soft and lethally numbing. Her breathing slowed to shallow, barely perceptible gasps. The sacred silver garment was completely buried under a fresh drift of pure white. Then, a massive shadow blocked the howling wind. Strong, weathered hands dug her out of the ice. A deep, gruff voice muttered an ancient prayer into the storm. It was Kenneth Vance, the wise patriarch of the Whispering Peaks pack and protector of the ancestral sanctuary, had been tracking the faint scent of her distress for miles. He lifted her freezing body as easily as a bundle of dry kindling. "Hold on, little one," Kenneth rumbled, wrapping his own heavy furs over her shivering form. "The sanctuary is near." 8 months later, the high mountain cabin was suffocatingly hot. The brutal winter had bled into a cool, harsh spring, but inside the small wooden room, the hearth fire roared like a captured sun. The air was thick with the visceral scent of boiling water, dried blood, and burning sage. Iris gripped the wooden headboard of the small bed until her knuckles turned translucent. She did not scream. The pain tearing through her lower body was absolute, blinding agony, but she locked it tightly behind her teeth. "Breathe, Iris," a gentle, commanding voice instructed. Lyra Snow, the trusted High Mountain midwife and healer, wiped a cool, damp cloth across Iris's feverish forehead. Her hands were swift and capable, stained with the green residue of herbal salves. At the heavy wooden door, Kenneth Vance stood like a stone sentinel, his massive frame blocking out the cold draughts, guarding the sacred secret of the exiled queen. "One more push," Lyra urged, her voice tight with focused tension. "The first one is here." With a final, bone-shattering effort, the tense silence of the cabin was pierced by a sharp, furious wail. The sound hit Iris's chest like a physical blow. The crushing biological exhaustion instantly vanished, replaced by a fierce, instinctual surge of maternal adrenaline. "A boy," Lyra whispered, quickly wrapping the tiny thrashing infant in a warm wool cloth. Before Iris could even reach for him, a second wave of contractions hit her with the brutal force of a landslide. She threw her head back, her spine arching off the mattress. The fated mating mark, which had been a dull, dead scar on her collarbone for 8 months, suddenly flared with a terrifying, phantom heat. Minutes later, the second cry joined the first. It was louder, deeper. It vibrated with a raw, unmistakable alpha pressure that made the ancient floorboards of the cabin groan in protest. Lyra approached the bed, holding 2 tightly wrapped bundles. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the infants with a mixture of profound awe and deep terror. She carefully placed them against Iris's chest. Iris looked down at her sons, Corin and Caelan. The twins were perfectly formed, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison against her skin. Corin, the eldest by a handful of minutes, lay quiet and watchful. Caelan squirmed relentlessly, his tiny fists already clenched, emitting a low, vibrating hum that belonged to a predator twice his age. But it was their eyes that stole the breath from Iris's lungs. As the twins blinked against the flickering firelight, they did not possess the soft, cloudy gaze of ordinary newborns. Their irises were a brilliant, glowing storm grey, the exact terrifying colour of the Alpha King, Eric's heirs. "The moon goddess preserve us," Kenneth murmured from the doorway, bowing his head in absolute reverence. Iris pulled her heavy winter wrap around her children, wrapping them securely in the protective silver fur. The human woman who had loved a king was dead. The mother of the true royal bloodline had just been born. She pressed a kiss to Corin's forehead, then to Caelan's. She would raise them here, hidden in the silence of the hidden mountains. She would teach them the strength of the stone and the patience of the ice. They would be ready when the time came. 5 winters passed. The silence of the Whispering Peaks was absolute, but the small mountain cabin was alive with motion. Corin and Caelan Sterling grew with terrifying speed. They were only 5 years old, but they moved with the lethal, instinctual grace of fully grown wolves. The raw power of the royal bloodline could not be suppressed by the high-altitude cold. Iris watched them from the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot pine tea. Corin sat on a heavy stump, his small brow furrowed as he read from a thick, leather-bound history of the Eastern Territories. He was serious, highly observant. He possessed an uncanny, instinctual diplomatic maturity that unnerved even Kenneth. Caelan was a different storm entirely. The younger twin was currently wrestling a massive timber wolf pup in the snow, his laughter ringing out, bright and fierce. His spiritual pressure, a heavy, static ozone, leaked into the air whenever he was excited, carrying a highly explosive alpha dominance that Iris had to constantly teach him to rein in. "They are getting stronger," Kenneth noted, stepping onto the porch beside her. The wise patriarch leaned heavily on his carved wooden staff, his eyes tracking the boys. "The wards around the sanctuary are beginning to strain under Caelan's presence." "And Corin." "The boy asked me about the trade routes through the rival empire today. He is studying the logistics of a war he has never seen." Iris took a slow, measured sip of her tea. "They are their father's sons. The summit approaches," Kenneth said quietly, his voice carrying the inescapable weight of impending fate. "Eric has summoned all regional envoys to the capital. Our territory must present our renewed treaties, or risk being absorbed by his military expansion." Iris froze, the mating mark on her collarbone, a jagged, white scar for 5 long years, gave a sudden phantom throb. It was a faint, agonizing echo, but it was there. "I cannot go," Iris said, her voice completely flat. "The sovereign exile decree is still absolute. If I cross the territorial borders, my life is forfeit." "You cannot," Kenneth agreed. "But the pact must be delivered." Before Iris could respond, the heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Corrin stood there, his glowing storm-grey eyes fixed intensely on his mother. Cailan flanked him a second later, his dark hair wild from the snow, his jaw set in a fiercely protective line. They had heard everything. "We will go," Corrin said. His voice was small, but it carried an eerie, unshakable authority that demanded absolute obedience. "We will present the Whispering Peaks trade pact to the Alpha King." Iris stared at her 5-year-old sons. They were small things in a world of teeth, but as she looked into their glowing grey eyes, she did not see frightened children. She saw the undisputed heirs of the throne, ready to reclaim the sanctuary that had been stolen from them. She set her tea down on the railing. "Bring me the parchment." Corrin stepped back into the main room of the cabin, returning a moment later with the heavy roll of vellum. He carried the territorial agreement, not like a child fetching a trivial household item, but like a seasoned diplomat bearing a loaded weapon. His small, steady hands offered it to his mother. Iris took the scroll. The rough texture of the dried animal skin scraped against her calloused fingertips, the friction serving as a sharp physical anchor. The heavy iron seal, dangling from the bottom ribbon, clinked against the wooden table. She looked at her 2 sons, standing shoulder to shoulder in the warm amber light of the hearth. The absolute reality of what they were proposing hit her with the physical force of a winter gale. To send them down the mountain and into the grand courtroom of the Northern Keep was to send them directly into the maw of the beast. The sudden surge of maternal terror threatened to suffocate her, bringing with it a violent, rushing wave of visceral memory. Her mind forcefully dragged her back to the harrowing, blood-soaked weeks immediately following their arrival at this sanctuary. The outer wilds were where you went to be forgotten. And Iris was very good at being unseen. She had spent the last 5 years mastering the art of absolute erasure, but the price of that invisibility had nearly cost her her life. The aftermath of delivering the absolute peak of the royal bloodline had not been a peaceful, quiet recovery. It had been a brutal, agonizing war of biological attrition. The human body was fundamentally not designed to harbor, birth, or nurse the sheer, concentrated magical density of prime alpha heirs. In those dark early days, her veins had felt as though they were filled with crushed, burning glass. Lyra Snow had been a ruthless, necessary savior. The trusted high mountain midwife did not offer soft platitudes or gentle comforts. She offered survival. For 30 days and 30 nights, the healer waged a relentless battle against Iris's failing biology. The cabin had been stiflingly hot, the air thick and heavy with the pungent, overwhelming scent of boiling winterleaf, dried blood, and burning cedar. Lyra's hands, perpetually stained a deep, bruised green from crushing bitter roots, moved with frantic, uncompromising precision. "Swallow it," Lyra had commanded, forcing a steaming pitch-black root tonic past Iris's cracked lips. "Your wolves are draining the very marrow from your bones to sustain their own growth. Drink, or they will starve, and you will fade into the ice." Iris had choked down the bitter ash every 4 hours. She had endured the searing fevers that racked her fragile human frame, her body shivering violently under layers of heavy furs, while the 2 infants radiated a terrifying, unnatural heat against her chest. The severed mating mark on her collarbone had been a constant, agonizing torment during that entire first season. Without the physical proximity of the Alpha King to soothe the biological trauma of the birth, the jagged scar had pulsed with a phantom, tearing heat. It was an instinctual tether, screaming at her subconscious to call out to her fated mate, demanding that the sovereign cross the borders and claim his family. She had denied the instinct. She had locked her jaw, swallowed the pain, and let the quiet dignity of her silence reign supreme. While the mother fought for her life inside the stifling heat of the cabin, Kenneth had waged his own war out in the freezing blizzards. The wise patriarch understood that the raw, untamed, spiritual pressure leaking from the newborn twins would eventually echo across the mountain ranges. It would act as a beacon for the capital's hunters. To prevent this, the old wolf had spent a full lunar cycle walking the treacherous, jagged perimeter of the high mountain ridge. He had carved deep, ancient warding runes into the frozen bedrock, bleeding his own palms to fill the carved stone with his life force. He had traded decades of his own lifespan to build an impenetrable, invisible fortress of silence around their small wooden home. They had survived the impossible of odds. But surviving was merely the baseline. Iris unrolled the heavy parchment on the table, her silver irises, scanning the elegant sweeping calligraphy of the trade agreement. Corin and Kaelin stepped up beside her. Their chins barely cleared the edge of the thick oak wood, yet their physical presence filled the small space like a looming thunderstorm. She had not raised them to be innocent children. She had forged them into weapons. For 5 years, the isolated stone cabin had served as a grueling, uncompromising academy of the wild. Iris had meticulously dismantled the sheltered ignorance that usually accompanied high-born youth. She had taught Corin the deep, unedited history of the Eastern Territories, the exact histories that the corrupt councillors in the capital actively tried to erase from the royal archives. She remembered the countless long winter nights spent huddled over faded, cracking maps. "Look closely at the borderlines," she had instructed the eldest twin, tracing a scarred finger along the jagged ink depicting the rival empire's territory. Vandred Thorn built his power on the illusion of this vulnerability. He claimed the southern pass was unguarded to justify a massive military tax on the outer packs, but the pass is not unguarded. It is impassable due to the winter floods. Corin had absorbed the information with a terrifying, silent precision. The young heir had memorized the exact geographical weaknesses, the historical troop movements, and the hidden silver reserves that the senior councillor had weaponized to forge the espionage ledgers. Iris had systematically taught her son how to dismantle a political lie, not by shouting, but through quiet absolute observation. If Corin was going to eventually face the usurper who had orchestrated their ruin, he would do so armed with undeniable surgical knowledge. "Knowledge is a blade," the mother had whispered to her quiet observer, as the hearth fire cast dancing shadows across his intense face. "A blade does not care who holds it. It only cares who swings it fastest. You must never let them see your hand move." Kaelin, however, had required an entirely different methodology of discipline. The younger twin was a walking, breathing manifestation of his father's lethal physical dominance. The boy could not be contained by ancient texts or political maps. His training had taken place in the brutal freezing snowdrifts outside the cabin walls. Iris recalled a specific morning, just 2 months prior, when the winter gale had been howling with elemental fury. Kaelin had grown frustrated while attempting to split a heavy pine log with a dull iron wedge. His spiritual pressure had instantly flared into a volatile, static ozone that made the hairs on Iris's arms stand on end. The feral, dominant aura leaking from the small boy was so intense that the ambient snow around his leather boots had instantly flash-melted into boiling steam. The massive timber wolves that patrolled the edge of the sanctuary had dropped to their bellies, whining in instinctual submission to a 5-year-old child. It was a power that could shatter Kenneth's fragile wards if left unchecked. Iris had marched out into the freezing slush, ignoring the biting cold that seeped immediately into her thin human garments. She had dropped to her knees in the wet snow directly in front of the furious boy. "Buriet," she had ordered. Her voice was flat, cold, and entirely unyielding. "I cannot," the fierce storm had growled, his tiny fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His glowing eyes were a violent vortex of primal fury. "It wants to break something. It wants them to know we are here. If the King's border patrols sense this pressure, they will not ask for your name," Iris had countered, gripping his small, burning shoulders. The heat radiating off his skin was agonizing against her freezing palms, but she did not flinch. "They will execute you in the snow. Power without absolute control is merely a target painted on your spine. The boy had bared his small teeth, fighting the agonizing internal war between his human logic and his feral wolf instinct. "You are not a slave to your blood," the exiled queen had told him, her voice dropping to a fierce anchoring whisper. "Not used, not owned. Chosen. You choose when to let them feel your weight. You choose when to be the storm. Until that exact moment, you are ice. Do you understand me?" It had taken grueling, repetitive conditioning, but eventually, Kalen had learned to pull the terrifying ozone pressure back into his chest, bottling his lightning behind a mask of stoic, frozen calm. The sudden popping of a cedar log in the hearth snapped Iris back to the immediate present. The training was over. The theory was about to become a lethal reality. She looked down at the parchment resting under her hands. It was, on the surface, a simple document demanding a fair economic exchange for the high mountain timber and rare medicinal herbs that the Whispering Peaks provided to the lower valleys. But in the hands of two boys carrying the sovereign's exact magical signature, it was a profound declaration of war against the corrupt council that currently ruled the capital. Kenneth stepped away from the heavy wooden door, moving closer to the oak table. The elder guardian leaned his massive weight on his carved staff, his weathered face lined with deep, heavy shadows. "Are you absolutely certain of this path, Iris?" the old wolf asked quietly. "The wards have kept you hidden. If they cross the territorial borders, the illusion is permanently broken. The moment they set foot inside the grand courtroom, Vandred will realize his failure. He will attempt to slaughter them before the Alpha King even comprehends what he is looking at." "He will try," she agreed softly. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. The panic that had gripped her moments ago had been carefully folded away, replaced by the flawless, defiant dignity that had allowed her to survive the altar of ash 5 years ago. The heavy wooden door to the back room creaked open, and Lyra emerged. The healer's face was drawn tight with barely concealed anxiety. Her jaw clenched as she carried 2 thick, leather-bound satchels. She placed them gently by the entryway. Her capable hands had packed enough dried venison, heavy healing salves, and bitter bloodroot to allow the small party to survive a month in the unforgiving wild. "The supplies are ready," Lyra murmured, her eyes lingering on the 2 boys with a fierce, protective sorrow. "The mountain passes are clear of the worst snowdrifts, but the temperature will drop sharply once you reach the lower valley." Iris nodded. She stepped around the heavy oak table and knelt on the rough wooden floorboards, bringing herself eye level with her sons. She reached out, carefully adjusting the thick, silver-tipped fur collars of their heavy winter cloaks. Her fingers brushed lightly against Corin's cheek, and then Kalen's. The tactile contrast was stark. Her skin was cool, human, and inherently fragile. Their skin radiated the heavy, burning gold warmth of an ancient, undeniable lineage. "Listen to me carefully," the mother instructed, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that demanded their absolute focus. "When you enter the royal fortress, you do not look at the floor. You keep your spines straight. You do not address the matriarchs. You do not respond to the provocations of the senior counselors. You will address only the sovereign." Corin held her gaze, his storm-grey eyes perfectly calm. "And if the council commands us to bow before the throne—" "You do not kneel to traitors," Iris stated, the words carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of an iron crown. "You are the envoys of the Whispering Peaks. You stand as equals to the stone you walk upon. You present the pact, you demand the sovereign's seal, and you accept nothing less than absolute recognition of your territory." Kalen's jaw tightened, a microscopic spark of static electricity crackling in the air around his small boots. "If they try to touch us, they will not touch you," she promised, her voice laced with a dark maternal certainty. "Because the moment they attempt to lay a hand on you, the entire courtroom will feel exactly what you are." She stood up slowly, her knees popping slightly in the quiet room. She looked over the heads of her children, her gaze finding the old wolf who had pulled her from the freezing oblivion 1/2 a decade ago. Kenneth was already pulling his heavy, scarred leather mantle over his broad shoulders, preparing to act as the official diplomatic escort for the young envoys. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king. Iris murmured to the empty air, her mind projecting the warning across the miles of frozen pine and jagged rock, directly toward the man sitting in isolation upon a throne of black iron. She turned her silver eyes to the patriarch. "Protect them, old friend," the wolfless mate commanded, her voice finally betraying a single hairline fracture of human emotion. "Bring my sons back to me." Kenneth struck the base of his heavy walking stick against the floorboards, the heavy thud resonating through the cabin like a sacred vow. "With my life," the guardian swore. Corin picked up the heavy roll of vellum, tucking it securely beneath his thick silver cloak. Cailan fell into step right beside him, his small hands resting near the hunting knife strapped to his waist. Without looking back, the young twin heirs turned toward the heavy wooden door, stepping out of the stifling heat of the sanctuary, and descending into the freezing, treacherous expanse of the world below. The descent from the high sanctuary was not a journey. It was a vertical plunge into a frozen hell. The jagged, wind-scoured slopes of the rugged highlands were merciless to the weak. For 3 days, the howling gales battered the small traveling party, the biting frost attempting to seep through their heavy leather mantles, to freeze the marrow in their bones. Kenneth Vance moved with the slow, measured endurance of an old wolf who intimately knew the mountain's lethal temperament. Every step the patriarch took sent a dull, throbbing ache through his scarred joints. The phantom pain of the ancient blood wards he had carved half a decade ago pulsed in his palms, a constant, heavy reminder of the life force he had traded to keep the exiled queen safe. But the young twins walking ahead of him did not shiver. Corin and Cailan moved through the knee-deep snowdrifts with terrifying, instinctual grace. The brutal atmospheric pressure of the high altitude, which normally crushed the lungs of seasoned warriors, did not seem to affect them at all. The heavy, silver-tipped fur collars of their cloaks were heavily dusted with white, but beneath the thick fabric, their small bodies radiated the intense, burning heat of an ancient lineage. The sovereign's blood acted as an internal furnace. It repelled the ice before the frozen moisture could even touch their skin, melting the snowflakes into harmless vapor instantly. Miles above their brutal descent, within the suffocating silence of the remote mountain cabin in the high sanctuary, Iris sat completely motionless by the dying hearth. The wolfless mate held her ancestral silver-furred cloak tightly in her lap. Her scarred fingers traced the thick, heavy edges of the garment, the very same fabric that had concealed her early pregnancy during her exile in the blinding blizzard. The cabin felt impossibly empty. The quiet was a physical weight pressing against her ribs. Staring into the glowing orange embers, Iris allowed herself to remember the things she usually kept locked behind iron doors. She remembered the agonizing, blood-soaked haze of her postpartum recovery in this exact room. The brutal, terrifying weakness that had nearly dragged her into the dark. It was the healer, Lyra Snow, who had pulled her back from the abyss. For 3 days and 3 nights, Lyra had worked tirelessly with crushed mountain herbs, boiling water, and sheer, uncompromising willpower, refusing to let the exiled queen die while the newborn twins wailed against the freezing wind outside. And then came the magic. Iris remembered the sharp, copper scent of blood filling the cabin as Kenneth Vance knelt on the rough floorboards. The old patriarch had carved the ancient blood wards directly into the stone foundation, willingly draining his own life force to build a magical dampener strong enough to mask the catastrophic, overwhelming royal scent of the infant princes. He had bled for her children. But Iris knew that hiding was not enough. They needed to be forged. As the years had passed, she had poured every ounce of her survival into her sons. She remembered the long, exhausting evenings spent leaning over this very table, training Corin by the flickering candlelight. She had drilled the eldest twin relentlessly in geography, intricate noble lineages, and the lethal political strategy of the capital courts, ensuring his mind was as sharp and unbreakable as cold steel. For Cailan, the training had required a different kind of endurance. The younger twin had inherited the volatile, explosive power of the Sovereign. Iris remembered kneeling in the knee-deep snow, her hands gripping Kaelin's small shoulders, teaching him over and over again how to breathe through the burning heat. She had taught him how to suppress his violent alpha pressure, how to cage the royal fire beneath his skin so he would not burn himself, or their sanctuary, to ash. She had built them into weapons of absolute discipline. Now they were walking directly into the maw of the beast. By the time the pale sun dipped below the jagged western ridges on the third evening, casting the treacherous world in bruised shades of violet and ash, the travelling party reached a flat expanse of solid blue ice known as the Mirror Plateau. "We camp here," Kenneth rumbled. His deep voice barely managed to cut through the screaming wind. He struck his carved wooden staff against the ice, anchoring his head frame against a sudden, violent gust. He set about building a small fire in the lee of a massive frost-covered boulder. His weathered hands were stiff, fumbling slightly with the flint and steel as the ambient temperature plummeted further. The spark finally caught the dry cedar kindling, casting a meager, flickering golden light into the encroaching darkness. Kenneth sank onto a flat stone, pulling his heavy leather mantle tight around his broad shoulders. He exhaled a long plume of white breath, expecting the young boys to immediately huddle close to the flames, to seek the simple, earthly comfort of the heat after 10 hours of grueling marching. Instead, they stepped away from the fire. "The cold makes the blood sluggish," Corrin observed quietly. The eldest twin unfastened the heavy iron clasp of his silver cloak, letting the thick garment fall to the ice. He stood only in his dark tunic and leather trousers, completely exposed to the sub-zero temperature. "We must keep it moving." Kaelin did not bother with words. He dropped his own cloak beside his brother's, his small jaw set in a fierce, eager line. They began their physical sparring in the dead center of the frozen plateau. At first, Kenneth watched them with mild, protective indulgence. But within 30 seconds, the old guardian's casual observation shattered into profound, breathless astonishment. This was not the clumsy, uncoordinated roughhousing of 5-year-old pups. This was a lethal, high-velocity exchange of absolute apex power. Kaelin attacked first. The younger twin did not just step forward, he vanished. The solid ice beneath his leather boots exploded outward in a violent spray of white powder as he launched himself at his brother. The sheer kinetic force of his movement defied human biology entirely. As the boy closed the distance, the ambient temperature around his body spiked violently. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the freezing air, smelling sharply of ozone and burning cedar. Then it manifested, the royal gold magic. It bled from Kaelin's small fists like liquid fire, wrapping his forearms in a blinding, ethereal golden flame. It was the exact unmistakable signature of the Alpha King, a raw, devastating biological power that belonged exclusively to the rulers of the Northern Keep. The golden magic hissed violently as it hit the freezing air, flash melting the frost in a wide radius. Kaelin threw a punch that carried enough concentrated force to shatter solid granite. Kenneth gripped his wooden staff, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He instinctively leaned forward, his muscles tensing to intervene, absolutely certain that the blow would break Corrin in half. But Corrin did not move. He did not flinch. The eldest twin stood perfectly still, his posture a flawless, unbroken mirror of Iris's quiet, defiant dignity. Just as the burning golden fist was about to make impact, Corrin shifted his weight by a microscopic fraction of an inch. His hands came up. They were not wrapped in fire, but rather cloaked in an absolute, suffocating stillness. Corrin caught his brother's wrist. The impact sounded like a thunderclap echoing across a deep canyon. A massive shockwave of displaced air and magic blasted outward in a perfect 50-foot radius. It instantly vaporized the surface layer of ice on the plateau, sending a blinding cloud of steam into the night sky. Kenneth was forced to throw his thick forearm up to shield his eyes from the blinding flash of gold and white. When the old wolf lowered his arm, he saw Corrin holding Kaelin's burning arm in a dead lock. The golden magic roared, twisting like a living beast, trying frantically to consume the older boy's hands. But the eldest twin was slowly, systematically suffocating the flames with his own absolute freezing counterpressure. Both boys opened their eyes simultaneously. The twilight shadows of the plateau were instantly banished by the brilliant, glowing light of their irises. Their tempest-hued irises burned with a terrifying, unearthly luminescence in the dark. It was the gaze of apex predators. It was the gaze of true sovereigns. "Your strike is too wide," Corrin stated. His voice was perfectly even, completely unaffected by the immense physical strain of holding back the royal fire. "You are relying on the heat to terrify your opponent before the physical blow lands. If you face an enemy who does not fear the flame, you leave your ribs entirely exposed." Cailan gritted his teeth, the golden embers flaring wildly around his small shoulders. "Then let them try to touch my ribs." The fierce storm twisted violently, utilizing the momentum to break the deadlock, and swept his leg low in a sweeping arc that cracked the solid blue ice beneath them. Corrin leaped backward, floating over the brutal strike with supernatural agility, landing softly 20 feet away without making a single sound. Kenneth sat frozen by the meager cedar fire, his breath caught tight in his throat. He had spent a full lunar cycle bleeding his own life force into the mountain stones to hide these children from the world. He had believed they were fragile. He had believed they desperately needed the whispering peaks to survive the winter. He was wrong. Watching the twins move, watching the lethal, explosive blur of Cailan's golden fire meeting the icy surgical precision of Corrin's stoic defense, Kenneth realized the terrifying truth. The boys were not surviving the mountain. The mountain was barely surviving them. The sheer, concentrated density of the royal magic radiating from their small bodies was suffocating the atmosphere. They were 5 years old, yet they moved with the tactical brilliance and catastrophic biological power of elite royal guards. Cailan surged forward again, unleashing a rapid, merciless volley of strikes. Each punch left a glowing, burning trail of gold in the dark air, attempting to overwhelm his opponent with sheer aggressive dominance. Corrin deflected every single blow. His movements were minimalist, expending exactly 0 unnecessary energy. Every time the younger twin's magic flared, Corrin's glowing storm grey eyes tracked the micro-shifts in his brother's muscles, predicting the exact trajectory of the violence before the blow was even fully thrown. It was the perfect synthesis of the sovereign's devastating power and the wolfless mate's flawless, unbreakable observation. "Enough," Kenneth finally rasped, his voice rough with profound awe. The twins stopped instantly. They did not stumble. They did not pant. The golden fire wrapping Cailan's arms vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, pulling back beneath his skin, and leaving only the heavy, static scent of ozone in its wake. Their glowing storm grey eyes slowly, deliberately dimmed back to their natural, piercing hue. They walked back to the fire in absolute silence, picking up their heavy silver cloaks from the ground. They had not broken a single sweat. The surrounding 50 feet of solid ice, however, was heavily scarred by deep, jagged gouges and melted pools of water that were already beginning to rapidly refreeze in the bitter wind. Kenneth stared at the boys, his mind racing through the terrifying political implications of what he had just witnessed. He had always known Iris carried a highly dangerous secret beneath her ancestral silver-furred cloak on the horrific day of her exile, but seeing the raw, unedited manifestation of Eric Sterling's lineage in the flesh left the old patriarch entirely breathless. "The capital is not ready for you," Kenneth whispered, staring deeply into the dancing cedar flames. Corrin pulled his thick cloak over his shoulders, his small expression completely unreadable. "They do not have to be ready, old friend. They only have to be present." By noon of the 4th day, the brutal vertical incline of the high peaks finally gave way to the treacherous, forested slopes of the lower valley. The jagged tree line thickened into a dense, oppressive wall of ancient black pines. The ambient temperature was still lethally cold, but the howling high-altitude gales had slowly subsided into a heavy, suffocating stillness. They reached the Iron Ridge outpost. The outpost was a massive, brutalist fortress built from raw mountain timber, dark stone, and rusted iron plating. It stood as the absolute final staging ground of the Outer Lands before the lands flattened out toward the Sovereign's sprawling capital. Normally, it functioned as a quiet, isolated garrison for border patrols. Today, however, the muddy courtyard was overflowing with armored wolves, heavy transport carriages, and highly nervous retainers. Inside the great central hall, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick with the scent of wet fur, stale mead, and raw, palpable fear. The regional clan leaders, the lesser alphas, and local lords of the mountain territories were gathered around a massive circular table of scarred oak. The Grand Territorial Summit had been officially called at the capital, and the Crown's demand for representation was absolute. Failure to present the territorial treaties to the Alpha King in person meant immediate, violent military absorption. It meant war. Kenneth pushed open the heavy iron doors of the great hall. The massive hinges groaned loudly in protest, instantly drawing the frantic, paranoid attention of every single noble in the room. The patriarch stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing sharply on the stone flagstones. He shed his frost-covered mantle, his imposing physical presence instantly silencing the panicked, overlapping shouting that had been echoing off the wooden rafters. Behind him, the two small figures of Corin and Kaelen remained entirely obscured by the deep shadows of the doorway, their heavy silver hoods pulled low over their faces. Kenneth, a burly, heavily scarred alpha from the eastern ridge, exhaled in profound relief. "You have finally descended from the sanctuary. Thank the goddess, we are at a complete loss. The summit approaches," another elder stated, his voice trembling noticeably as he pointed a shaking finger toward a heavy scroll, sealed with thick black wax resting on the center of the table. "The Sovereign's summons. The Alpha King demands the Whispering Peaks trade pact be presented in person by our highest authority. But Eric Sterling has grown completely unhinged over the past 5 winters. He executes envoys for the slightest perceived disrespect. Sending our people down to the Northern Keep right now is a guaranteed death sentence. Vandred Thorn controls the capital courts," the Eastern Alpha argued bitterly, slamming his heavy fist onto the oak wood. "The senior counselor whispers poison into the king's ear, and the sovereign merely acts as his feral executioner. They are using this summit to bleed the outer territories dry. We must send a proxy, someone entirely expendable. We cannot risk the blood of the clan leaders." Kenneth leaned heavily on his aged timber cane, his sharp eyes scanning the terrified faces of the gathered lords. These were the men who proudly claimed to rule the harsh mountains, yet they were currently cowering at the mere shadow of the Sovereign's seal. "The Alpha King does not accept proxies," Kenneth stated, his voice flat and uncompromising. "He requires a true representative of the blood. He requires absolute authority to validate the treaty." "And who exactly among us holds that authority?" The scarred elder sneered, his deep-seated fear rapidly twisting into defensive hostility. "Will you go, old man? Will you proudly march into the maw of the beast and offer your throat?" Before Kenneth could offer a response, a small, perfectly steady voice cut cleanly through the heavy stale silence of the hall. "He will not go alone." Corin stepped out of the shadows. He reached up and deliberately threw back the hood of his heavy silver cloak. Kaelen stepped out immediately beside him, his jaw set, his dark hair wild and windblown from the long journey. The clan leaders stared down at the young children in utter dismissive bewilderment. "What is this?" the Eastern Alpha demanded, scoffing loudly. "Kenneth, you bring children to a war council." The lesser elders didn't know the boys standing before them were the true heirs of the Alpha King. They didn't know the raw, catastrophic magical power quietly humming just beneath the children's skin. All they saw were 2 small boys wrapped in winter cloaks, entirely out of place among hardened warriors. Corin completely ignored the insult. He walked forward with the flawless, straight-spined dignity that belonged entirely to his exiled mother. He bypassed the armored guards standing by the walls, who instinctively stepped back, deeply unnerved by the absolute lack of fear in the boy's stride. Corin reached the edge of the heavy oak table. He reached into his dark tunic and withdrew the heavy roll of vellum, the High Mountain Accord. He placed it squarely on top of the Sovereign's black-sealed summons. "We will carry the pact," Corin announced. His voice was not loud, but it possessed an eerie, unshakable acoustic resonance that echoed off the stone walls and demanded immediate attention. "We volunteer to represent the Whispering Peaks at the Grand Territorial Summit." A beat of highly tense, stunned silence fell over the hall. Then, a few of the elders barked out harsh, nervous laughter. "You offer children to the Sovereign's teeth," an elder mocked, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "This is utter madness. The king will butcher them before they even cross the threshold of the grand courtroom." Kaelin's eyes flashed. The younger twin took a single, deliberate half-step forward. The heel of his leather boot struck the stone flagstone with a sharp crack. Instantly, the ambient temperature in the great hall plummeted to freezing, while simultaneously the heavy scent of burning ozone flooded the enclosed space. Kaelin unleashed a microscopic fraction of his raw alpha pressure. It was not a physical attack. It was a sheer, suffocating, psychic weight of absolute, indisputable dominance. The heavy wooden table groaned under the invisible pressure. The stale ale in the tankards rippled violently. Every single clan leader in the room choked on their breath. The nervous laughter died instantly in their throats. Several of the lesser alphas actually dropped heavily to one knee, their inner wolves whimpering in sudden, terrifying biological submission to a sovereign power they could not logically comprehend. The room was entirely paralyzed. Corin did not even look at his brother. He kept his storm grey eyes locked entirely on the Elder Alpha. As the ambient magic flared through the hall, Corin's irises began to glow with that terrifying, luminescent grey light. "We do not offer ourselves to the teeth," Corin said, his words falling like heavy iron blocks into the suffocating, ozone-filled silence. He spoke with the exact, unyielding cadence of Iris. It was the absolute authority of a mother who had survived the altar of ash, channeled flawlessly through the vessel of her son. "We go to pull them." The scarred Alpha stared directly into those glowing storm-grey eyes, his face paling rapidly as logical recognitions and primal terror finally warred in his brain. He saw the distinct, undeniable lineage. He felt the crushing biological weight of the crown pressing down heavily on his spine, forcing his chin downward. "Who? What are you?" the Alpha gasped, his knuckles turning bone-white as he clutched the edge of the oak table, simply to keep from collapsing entirely under Kaelin's crushing pressure. "We are the envoys of the Whispering Peaks," Corin replied, his tone remaining perfectly cold, polite, and completely devoid of arrogance. "We are no one's pawns, neither wielded nor possessed. We are masters of our own fate, and we have chosen to carry this treaty to the royal fortress." Corin looked up at Kenneth, who stood quietly by the heavy iron doors, watching the entire exchange with a faint, grim smile of profound satisfaction. The patriarch struck the base of his carved wooden staff against the stone floor, the loud thud deliberately breaking the oppressive, magical silence of the room. "The decision is made," Kenneth declared, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner's blade. "The heirs have formally volunteered. Prepare the transport carriages. We depart for the capital by nightfall." No one in the great hall dared to utter a single word of protest. The terrified clan leaders slowly pushed themselves back to their feet, their eyes carefully averted, their throats bared in silent, absolute reverence. They did not know the full political truth of the boy's hidden bloodline, but their inner wolves knew exactly what had just happened in this room. The sovereignty of the Whispering Peaks had just irrevocably shifted. Corin turned away from the table, leaving the heavy vellum pact resting directly over the king's black seal. He walked back toward the heavy iron doors, Kaelin pulling his pressure back into his chest and falling into perfect step right beside him. As the two boys stepped back out into the freezing wind of the muddy courtyard, preparing for the final, lethal leg of their journey, into the heart of the enemy's stronghold, they did not look like innocent children walking to their doom. They looked like kings returning to claim their throne. The heavy transport carriage rattled violently as it descended the final treacherous switchbacks of the lower mountain range. The brutal, vertical incline of the eastern ranges had slowly given way to the wide, flattened military roads that led directly into the heart of the capital. Outside the reinforced wooden walls of the vehicle, the freezing winter gales had diminished into a heavy, oppressive fog that clung to the dark pine forests like a burial shroud. The ambient temperature was still lethally cold, but it lacked the biting, razor-sharp purity of the high sanctuary. Down here in the lowlands, the cold felt stagnant. It smelled of wet earth, burning coal, and the distant, metallic tang of an expanding military empire that consumed everything it touched. Inside the cramped, shadowy interior of the carriage, Kenneth Vance sat across from the two boys. The old wolf leaned heavily against the wooden paneling, his broad shoulders swaying with every jarring impact of the iron-rimmed wheels against the cobblestones. His scarred joints throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. The phantom pain radiating from his palms was a constant, brutal reminder of the life force he had bled into the mountain stones 5 years ago to carve the blood wards that hid these children. He was exhausted down to his marrow, but his sharp amber eyes remained locked in a state of absolute, hyper-vigilant focus. They were crossing the territorial borders. They were entering the maw of the beast. There was no turning back now. The Capitol Guards possess heightened senses, Kenneth stated, his deep voice barely rising above the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the sound of iron striking stone echoing through the damp cabin. He reached into his thick leather mantle and retrieved a small, heavy obsidian jar. They are trained to detect the slightest biological anomaly. If they catch the raw scent of the sovereign's bloodline before you reach the safety of the throne room, they will not ask for your names. They will slaughter you in the streets to protect the current council's fragile hierarchy. Corin and Kaelin sat perfectly still on the opposite bench. They did not exhibit the frantic, nervous energy typical of 5-year-old children approaching a lethal confrontation. They had been raised in the silent, unforgiving frost, tutored by a mother who had survived the absolute worst of this world. They watched with stoic, unblinking intensity as the patriarch unscrewed the heavy lid of the jar. The confined space was instantly filled with the pungent, overwhelming aroma of crushed winterleaf, bitter ash, and dried blood. It was Lyra Snow's masking paste, a harsh concoction brewed specifically in the high sanctuary to suppress the catastrophic magical signature radiating from the twins. "We must bind the scent," Kenneth instructed, leaning forward. He reached out and pressed his thick, calloused thumb into the dark green paste. He motioned for Corin first. The eldest twin leaned forward, exposing the delicate skin of his neck. Kenneth applied the bitter mixture directly to the boy's pulse points, the inside of his wrists, the hollow of his throat, and just behind his ears. The paste was highly acidic, designed to temporarily numb the magical pathways beneath the skin. It stung violently upon contact, leaving angry red welts in its wake, but Corin did not flinch. His storm-grey eyes remained perfectly flat, his spine perfectly straight, mirroring the flawless, unbreakable dignity of his exiled mother. He breathed in the stinging scent of ash and held it. "Vandred Thorn controls the outer gates," Corin observed quietly, his small voice echoing the precise tactical lessons Iris had drilled into him by the hearth fire during the long, freezing winters. "The senior counselor relies on the illusion of absolute authority to keep the lesser packs in line. He rules through fear and forged ledgers. We will not engage with his provocations. He is merely an obstacle between us and the throne. We do not answer to him." Kenneth nodded grimly, marveling at the sheer, cold calculation radiating from the boy. He was a master tactician trapped in the body of a child, possessing an instinctual diplomatic maturity that terrified even the elder guardian. Then, it was Kaelin's turn. The younger twin leaned forward, his small jaw set in a fierce, defiant line. As Kenneth pressed the stinging paste against the boy's throat, a violent, instinctual reaction occurred. Kaelin's inner wolf, a feral, apex predator forged from the absolute peak of the royal bloodline, violently rejected the chemical suppression. The ambient temperature inside the carriage spiked by 20 degrees in a single, breathless second. A microflash of liquid golden magic hissed against Kenneth's thumb, smelling sharply of static ozone, crushed pine, and burning cedar. The raw alpha pressure fought the chemical cage, attempting to burn the invasive herbs away. "Hold it down!" "Kaelin," Kenneth ordered, his voice dropping to a low, warning growl. "Cage the fire. You cannot let them feel your weight yet. We must pass the gates unseen." The fierce storm gritted his teeth. The muscles in his small neck corded with intense physical strain as he fought a brutal internal war against his own volatile biology. He forced his breathing to slow, dragging the heavy, burning golden magic back down into his chest, locking the feral instincts behind a mask of frozen ice, exactly as his mother had taught him in the deep snowdrifts. The static charge in the air slowly dissipated, leaving behind only the suffocating smell of the bitter paste and the faint, lingering heat of suppressed sovereign power. "They will feel it when the doors open," Kaelin promised, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal certainty. The carriage suddenly decelerated, the heavy iron brakes shrieking against the wet cobblestones. Kenneth shifted his weight, pulling the thick canvas curtain aside by a fraction of an inch to peer out into the grey morning mist. The towering architecture of the citadel loomed above them, a massive, brutalist fortress of black stone, jagged iron spikes, and high-arched Gothic windows. It was a monument to isolation, sovereign paranoia, and ancient bloodshed. The massive iron gates of the outer courtyard stood open, flanked by dozens of heavily armoured guards, bearing the silver wolf crest on their heavy mantles. This was exactly where it had happened. This was the very threshold where Iris Vance had been stripped of her lunar crown, her pack protection, and her fundamental dignity. Kenneth remembered watching her walk out of these gates 5 winters ago, alone in the howling wind. She had kept her spine straight, her silver-furred mantle wrapped tightly around her freezing shoulders to conceal her early pregnancy, her womb carrying the hidden salvation of the entire empire. Now, the cycle was reversing. The blood she had bled to protect was returning to the stone that had cast her out. The carriage rolled through the towering iron gates, the sound of the wheels transitioning from rough, uneven cobblestone to the smooth, polished flagstones of the inner royal courtyard. The vehicle finally ground to a complete, shuddering halt. Kenneth struck the base of his seasoned rod against the floorboards. The heavy thud was a final anchoring command that reverberated in the small space. "Remember your sovereignty," the patriarch whispered, his amber eyes burning with fierce, protective pride. "We are masters of our own fate," the twins finished in perfect, chilling unison. Kenneth pushed the heavy wooden door of the carriage open. The biting winter breeze of the capital rushed in, carrying the scent of stale fear, political desperation, and impending ruin. The elder guardian stepped out into the freezing mud, and the 2 young heirs of the Northern Keep followed him into the light, preparing to tear the Empire's greatest lie to absolute shreds. The grand courtroom of the Northern Keep was designed to humble the weak. Its towering arched ceilings disappeared into a canopy of dark, suffocating shadows, while the ancient flagstones radiated a bone-deep chill that intentionally dragged the body temperature of anyone standing trial down to a state of shivering vulnerability. The cavernous hall was currently packed with regional envoys, wealthy matriarchs, and heavily armed military commanders from every corner of the realm. The air was stifling, thick with the overwhelming scent of nervous sweat, expensive, heavy perfumes, and the sharp, coppery tang of political desperation. The Grand Territorial Summit was not a genuine diplomatic negotiation. It was a thinly veiled execution block designed to crush any remaining dissent. Vandred Thorn stood in the exact center of the vast floor, pacing with the predatory arrogance of a starved hound that had finally cornered its prey. The senior counselor wore elegant garments of silver and slate grey, his sharp face beautiful in the way a fatal winter frost is beautiful. There was no warmth in his pale eyes, only the cold calculation of absolute control. He had fabricated the espionage ledgers that drove Iris away, and now he was finishing his work. He was currently addressing the gathered assembly, his voice dripping with poisoned honey as he demanded the complete military absorption of the outer mountain territories. "The mountain clans have shown their true cowardly nature," Vandred declared smoothly, his words echoing sharply off the high stone pillars. "They have refused to send a recognized envoy to this summit. They openly defy the sovereign summons, hiding in their high sanctuary like frightened prey. By the ancient laws of the Pack, this silence is an undeniable act of treason, and their lands must be immediately seized by the crown. Their independence is a threat to the stability of our great empire." The noble crowd murmured in greedy agreement, the sound like a swarm of locusts. Their eyes darted nervously toward the raised dais at the far end of the hall, seeking the ultimate validation of their theft. The dungeons of the capital were where you went to be forgotten, but Alpha King Eric Sterling had built his own freezing prison right here upon the raised dais. He sat upon the throne of black iron, looking like a god who had been entirely hollowed out by his own unimaginable power. The physical deterioration of the terrifying monarch over the past 5 winters was stark, visceral, and agonizing to witness. Eric possessed a sheer mass of lethal muscle and ancient authority, but he sat slumped against the heavy metal, completely motionless, the Winterbane curse of his bloodline, a devastating condition that required the grounding, warm presence of a true fated mate to control, was slowly freezing him from the inside out. Without Iris to anchor his beast, his blood had turned to ice, and his humanity was slipping away into a dark, feral abyss of endless winter. He exhibited explicit, terrifying signs of self-restraint. Heavy, cold iron chains were loosely draped over the thick armrests of the throne, a voluntary measure he had demanded to remind his inner wolf not to leap down and indiscriminately slaughter his own sycophantic court. His broad chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged, agonizing motions. His clouded irises were dull, dead, and entirely devoid of light, staring blankly at the stone floor as if seeing ghosts in the frost. The severed mating mark on his collarbone was a constant, freezing void, a jagged white scar that pulsed with a dull, agonizing emptiness every single time his damaged heart managed to beat. He did not care about the Whispering Peaks. He did not care about Vandred's political maneuvering or the forged espionage ledgers that ran this court. He cared about absolutely nothing. The world had ended 5 years ago, in a blinding white blizzard, the day he signed the sovereign exile decree, and he was merely a ghost haunting the rotting halls of his own keep. "We await your judgment, my king," Vandred pressed, stepping closer to the base of the dais, and offering a theatrical mocking bow that dripped with condescension. "Grant us the decree to march on the mountains. Let us cleanse the sanctuary of their defiance." Eric slowly lifted his heavy iron-crowned head. The dead, suffocating winter in his eyes caused a ripple of primal terror to wash over the front row of nobles, forcing them to take involuntary steps backward. He opened his mouth, the freezing air curling from his lips, to speak the words that would condemn the mountain sanctuary to ash. Then, a violent, unnatural disturbance erupted at the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall. The sound of heavy, plate steel armor crashing violently against stone echoed through the cavernous space. A royal guard, stationed outside the doors, choked audibly, gasping for air as if an invisible crushing hand had suddenly seized his throat. The overlapping murmurs of the noble crowd died instantly, replaced by a tense, utterly breathless silence. The heavy oak doors did not simply swing open, they shattered inward. The massive iron hinges groaned and shrieked in violent protest as the sheer kinetic force of an unseen alpha pressure forced the ancient wood apart. A blinding gust of freezing winter wind rushed into the stale, suffocating courtroom, instantly dropping the ambient temperature by 10 degrees and extinguishing a dozen torches along the walls. Corin and Cailan Sterling strode through the threshold. Kenneth Vance walked exactly 3 paces behind them, leaning heavily on his carved wooden staff, his jaw locked tight, acting as the silent, looming shadow of their protection. The moment the young princes stepped into the epicenter of the sovereign's territory, the ambient, magical density of the stronghold reacted to their presence. The ancient defensive wards built into the stone floor violently clashed with the bitter masking paste Lyra Snow had applied to their pulse points. The dried green herbs instantly flaked off their wrists and throats, burning away into fine white ash that scattered on the freezing wind. The chemical suppression dropped completely. A catastrophic, overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered alpha pressure flooded the hall. It hit the gathered assembly like a physical crushing shockwave, accompanied by the heavy, unmistakable scent of burning gold, freezing cedar, and raw, static ozone. It was the scent of the bloodline. It was the scent of absolute kingship. The physiological reaction of the court was instantaneous and brutally involuntary. The arrogant human nobles attempted to turn and sneer at the interruption, but their biological inner wolves instantly recognized the arrival of an apex predator. The sheer density of the royal magic, radiating from the two small bodies, was suffocating. Several wealthy matriarchs collapsed heavily to their knees, their expensive silk dresses pooling on the dirty stone, their throats bared in involuntary, whimpering submission. High-born lords staggered backward, clutching their chests as the heavy spiritual pressure literally sucked the oxygen from their lungs, forcing them to bow. Vandred Thorn didn't know the boys stepping into the hall were the Alpha King's true heirs. He didn't know the thick, ancient blood running through their tiny veins was the exact lineage he had tried to erase 5 years ago when he pushed for the exile. All the senior counselor knew was that his legs suddenly felt like lead, his heart hammered violently against his ribs, and his lungs refused to expand against the crushing, golden weight in the air. Corin and Kaelin ignored the cowering crowd. They walked perfectly in sync down the wide central aisle, their small boots clicking rhythmically against the flagstones. They were retracing the exact path their mother had taken on the day she was banished. But where Iris had walked with the quiet, stoic dignity of a survivor enduring a massacre, her sons walked with the lethal, explosive confidence of conquerors returning to claim what was stolen. They looked like small things in a world of teeth, but the feral beasts of the court were currently choking on their own fear just to watch them pass. Kaelin's small fists were clenched tightly at his sides, a microscopic trace of liquid golden fire flickering dangerously at his fingertips, a terrifying manifestation of royal gold magic, daring anyone to step in their way. Corin's posture was a flawless, unbroken line of diplomatic authority, his heavy silver-furred cloak sweeping against the stone. In his small, unyielding hand, he carried the heavy, gold-sealed Whispering Peaks trade pact. He held the ancient parchment not like a plea, but like a drawn blade, wielding the sacred agreement with a gravity that demanded absolute submission from the entire room. They did not look at the nobleman. They did not look at Vandred. Their luminous silver gaze locked entirely on the black iron throne at the end of the hall. On the raised dais, Eric Sterling suffered a violent biological rupture. The dead, frozen scar on his collarbone, the severed mating mark that had not felt anything but numb, hollow agony for half a decade, suddenly flared with a blinding, excruciating, burning heat. It was not a memory. It was a visceral, physical, physiological reaction. The fated bond was screaming, coming violently alive, recognizing the close proximity of its own biological creation. The monarch's head snapped up so fast his neck cracked. His massive hands gripped the iron armrests of the throne, his knuckles turning instantly bone white. The heavy chains draped over the metal rattled violently as a massive, uncontrollable tremor racked his entire body. The dead, suffocating winter in his eyes completely shattered, replaced by a frantic, swirling vortex of shock, disbelief, and a terrifying awakening fire. He saw the boys. He saw the thick, dark hair. He saw the proud, unbroken posture that belonged entirely to the woman he had sent into the snow to die. But more than anything, he saw their eyes. As Corin and Kaelin approached the base of the dais, the dim, flickering light of the courtroom caught their irises, illuminating the exact, terrifying storm-grey color that belonged exclusively to his own bloodline. He felt the crushing, undeniable resonance of his own golden magic rolling off their small shoulders, singing directly to the feral, starved beast locked inside his chest. The entire council chamber was paralyzed in absolute, terrified silence. The sheer impossibility of the moment had frozen time itself. Corin, reached the lowest stone step of the dais and stopped. Kalen halted right beside him, his golden pressure flaring like a halo of static ozone. They did not bow, they did not tremble. They did not offer the customary submission required of outer territory envoys facing the sovereign. They stood perfectly upright, staring directly into the frantic, hyper-dilated eyes of the most dangerous wolf in the Empire, presenting the gold-sealed Whispering Peaks trade pact to a king who had just realized his entire existence was a lie. The silence that followed was a physical weapon. It was the suffocating, heavy quiet of a kingdom that was about to be torn apart at the seams. The Alpha King could not draw breath. Eric Sterling sat paralyzed upon the black iron throne, his massive chest locked in a sudden, terrifying state of biological suspended animation. Every single instinctual fiber of his being, every dormant, freezing pathway of his nervous system was screaming. It was a deafening, catastrophic roar of a feral, starved inner beast that had suddenly, violently recognized its own blood. The severed mating mark on his left collarbone, a jagged, dead white scar that had offered nothing but a hollow echoing agony for 5 long winters, was now radiating a blinding, white-hot intensity. It did not feel like a memory. It felt as though a blade forged from molten gold had just been driven directly into his soul, violently overwriting the numbing frost of his winterbane curse with the undeniable physiological proximity of his fated mate's creation. The very blood in his veins, long thickened by grief and the ancient frost, began to boil, rushing through his limbs with a catastrophic force that threatened to shatter his ribs. He stared down at the small children standing at the base of the dais. They were impossible. His fragmented, grief-poisoned human logic desperately tried to categorize them as a hallucination, a cruel, elaborate mirage pulled from the darkest, most desperate corners of his solitary confinement. But hallucinations did not carry the crushing atmospheric density of a looming high mountain thunderstorm. Hallucinations did not flood the stale, suffocating air of the grand courtroom with the heavy, unmistakable scent of static ozone, freezing cedar, and the deep, resonant aroma of burning gold. The air itself seemed to crackle and warp around the 2 small figures, defying the freezing miasma that usually clung to the sovereign's throne room. The Alpha King gripped the armrests of his throne. The thick metal groaned, physically buckling and warping inward under the sheer, unthinking kinetic pressure of his massive hands. The heavy, cold iron chains draped across his lap rattled violently, the metal links clinking against the stone in the dead, breathless silence of the hall. He was trembling. The most lethal apex predator in the known empire, a monarch whose mere presence usually forced entire armies into submission, was currently shaking like a fragile pane of glass caught in a hurricane. Sweat, cold and sharp as mountain ice, broke across his forehead. His storm-grey eyes, the exact same luminescent, terrifying shade as the irises staring back at him, frantically, desperately mapped the faces of the children. He saw the straight, flawless, unbroken line of Corin's spine. The eldest boy held the heavy vellum scroll of the trade pact with a quiet, defiant dignity that bypassed Eric's vision and struck directly at his deepest memories. It was her posture. It was the exact, unmistakable, stoic grace Iris had displayed on the day she had stood on this very stone, curtsied before this very throne, and walked out into a lethal blizzard without shedding a single tear. The boy's silence was not born of fear. It was the impenetrable, unyielding armor of a survivor who had been raised amidst the howling winds of the Whispering Peaks. Then his frantic gaze shifted to Kalen. The younger twin's jaw was locked in a fierce protective line, his small fists clenched at his sides. A microscopic, terrifying flicker of liquid golden magic danced across the boy's knuckles. Royal gold magic, the absolute, indisputable biological signature of the Northern Keep's sovereign lineage. The sheer concentration of raw alpha power radiating from the small child was staggering, a volatile, explosive fire that matched the king's own buried inner beast, beat for beat. The shadows in the cavernous hall physically retreated from the boy, repelled by the searing, ancient light of his birthright. Eric's lips parted. The freezing air curled from his mouth as he tried to speak, but his throat was raw, completely closed off by a tidal wave of unimaginable shock and a grief so profound it threatened to shatter his ribs from the inside out. Who? The word emerged as a broken, hollow rasp. It did not sound like the broken monarch's voice. It sounded like the dying, desperate gasp of a man who had spent 5 years drowning in a frozen lake, finally breaching the surface, only to find the air itself was ablaze. Who are you? Corran did not flinch at the sound of the Alpha King's broken voice. The eldest twin maintained his perfect, unyielding stance, his heavy ancestral, silver-furred cloak brushing against the lowest stone step of the dais. He did not look back at the cowering, terrified nobles behind him. He did not acknowledge the frantic, overlapping whispers beginning to ripple through the wealthy matriarchs and military commanders. He kept his glowing tempest-hued wolfed irises locked entirely on the shattered man sitting upon the throne. "We are the appointed envoys of the Whispering Peaks," Corran stated. His voice was perfectly steady, carrying an eerie, unshakable diplomatic authority that echoed flawlessly off the high vaulted ceilings, cutting through the murmurs like a finely honed blade. "We have come to present our territorial trade pact to the crown." Eric shook his massive head slowly, a jerky, erratic motion of absolute denial. The heavy iron chains clattered again, sliding off his lap and crashing heavily onto the stone dais. He ignored them. He ignored the shocked gasps of the court. He ignored the entire political structure of his sprawling empire. His human logic was completely offline, entirely overridden by the frantic, howling demands of his inner wolf demanding to claim its blood. "No," the king choked out, his broad chest heaving as he fought for a single lungful of oxygen. He leaned forward, the heat radiating from his chest, battling the spidery frost of his curse. The scent of them was overwhelming, bypassing all logic and striking the core of his fated bond. "Your blood, the magic. I know this scent. It is my own. Tell me your names." The silence in the grand courtroom stretched taut, pulled past the absolute breaking point. Every single lord and lady in the hall held their breath, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic emotional tension radiating from the dais. Kalen took a single, deliberate half-step forward. The heel of his small leather boot struck the flagstone. The ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity spiked instantly, the scent of burning ozone growing suffocatingly thick. The fierce storm did not possess his brother's quiet, diplomatic restraint. Kalen looked up at the towering, terrifying monarch, his small face contorted with a fierce, primal fury that belonged entirely to a son defending his mother's honor against the monster who had broken her. "We are Corran and Kalen," the younger twin declared, his voice vibrating with a raw, undeniable alpha pressure that forced the closest royal guards to drop heavily to their knees in involuntary biological submission, their halberds clattering uselessly against the stone. Eric stared at the fierce boy, the names hitting his chest like a volley of heavy iron arrows. Kalen lifted his chin, his stormy gaze narrowing as he delivered the final, devastating, world-ending blow. "And our mother is Iris, the woman you called a traitor, the woman you threw into the snow to die." The words did not merely echo in the cavernous courtroom, they detonated. The absolute, horrific truth of the statement slammed into Alpha King Eric Sterling with the catastrophic force of a collapsing mountain. Iris, the phantom warning of a silenced past returning to bite, echoed violently in the darkest, most hollow chambers of his mind, tearing through his psychological defenses, and leaving nothing but raw, bleeding devastation in its wake. The teeth were currently sinking into his heart, shredding the very fabric of his sanity. The realization hit his brain in a series of violent, blinding, agonizing flashes of memory. She had been pregnant. On the day of the trial, when she stood before the hostile council completely alone, wrapped in the heavy, impenetrable folds of her ancestral silver-furred cloak, she had been carrying his children. She had kept her hands pressed so tightly over her stomach, not in an act of submission, but in an act of absolute, uncompromising maternal protection. She had absorbed the crushing, physical agony of the severed mating mark, accepted the sovereign exile decree, without offering a single word of defense, and walked out into a lethal high mountain whiteout because she knew the absolute truth. She knew that if the corrupt council discovered she carried the royal bloodline, they would have slaughtered her unborn pups before the sun set. She had not betrayed the pack. She had sacrificed her name, her home, and her safety to shield his heirs from the teeth of his own court. She had endured the visceral agony of the severed soul thread in absolute silence. A guttural, agonizing sound tore itself from Eric's throat. It was not a human noise. It was the raw, primal, soul-shattering scream of a wolf realizing it had gnawed off its own limb to escape a trap, only to discover the trap was an illusion engineered by its own pack. The sound rattled the stained glass windows and sent a wave of sheer, instinctual panic rippling through the remaining nobles. The Alpha King doubled over, his massive hands clutching the sides of his head as a wave of catastrophic, paralyzing regret crashed over him, drowning him completely. The physical pain of the revelation was blinding. His lungs burned as if he had inhaled crushed glass. His vision blurred, swimming with the phantom image of her walking away. He remembered the exact, booming sound the heavy oak doors had made when they sealed her fate. He remembered the dead, hollow emptiness that had consumed his life every single day since she vanished. He had spent 5 winters convinced she had sold his borders to the rival empire, drowning in a toxic, suffocating mix of betrayal and longing. Meanwhile, she had been entirely alone in the freezing high country, bleeding, starving, and fighting to raise the strongest heirs the Northern Keep had ever seen, and he had missed all of it. He had missed their first breaths. He had missed the agonizing nights of their fevers. He had missed their first steps in the snow. He had missed the 5 years of brutal, quiet survival she had endured purely because he had chosen the laws of a corrupt council over the instinctual truth of his fated mate. His hands shook violently as the sheer magnitude of what he had lost threatened to stop his heart entirely. Iris, the king gasped, the name tearing his throat raw, tasting like copper and ash. He looked up, his tempestuous eyes swimming with absolute devastation. She survived the ice. She survived, Corin confirmed softly, his tone completely devoid of pity, standing as an unmovable monument to his mother's resilience. The eldest twin lowered the heavy vellum scroll by a fraction of an inch. But she did not send us here to seek your recognition, Alpha King. We are masters of our own fate. She chose to build a sanctuary in the Whispering Peaks, and she sent us to secure its borders against your military expansion. The absolute staggering grief that had just crippled the sovereign did not remain grief for long. In a matter of mere seconds, the crushing sorrow warping Eric Sterling's features underwent a terrifying, violent metamorphosis. The realization of his own catastrophic failure rapidly morphed into an apocalyptic, world-ending fury directed entirely at the architects of that failure. The espionage ledgers, the forged diplomatic documents, the senior council's relentless, poisoned whispers insisting that the wolfless maid was a spy. Eric's head snapped up. The dead, freezing winter in his eyes had been entirely incinerated, replaced by a swirling, chaotic maelstrom of absolute, untethered murder. He pushed himself off the black iron throne. The movement was so sudden, so explosively violent, that the remaining heavy iron chains binding the armrests did not just rattle. They snapped. The thick metal links shattered like brittle glass under the sheer, unthinking kinetic force of the Alpha King's resurrected rage, the pieces raining down upon the dais. The sound of breaking iron echoed like a cannon shot in the cavernous hall. The entire noble assembly recoiled in collective, visceral terror. The wealthy matriarchs who had sneered at Iris 5 years ago now scrambled backward in blind panic, their expensive silk dresses tearing against the rough flagstones as they tried to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the dais. The hardened military commanders instinctively stepped back, their hands trembling near the hilts of swords they dared not draw. No man ever survived him when the Winterbane curse gave way to the royal fire. Eric did not look at the screaming crowd. His feral stare locked onto one specific figure standing frozen in the exact center of the hall. Vandred Thorn, the senior councillor's face, usually a flawless mask of elegant, frosty superiority, was currently completely devoid of blood. The man was staring at the two 5-year-old boys, his pale eyes wide with absolute, uncomprehending horror. Vandred had fabricated the treason charges. He had forged the magical signatures on the espionage ledgers, using dark, illicit blood magic. He had orchestrated the exile to clear the path for his own daughter to claim the lunar crown. And now, the absolute, undeniable proof of his treachery was standing in the middle of the court, radiating the sovereign's own golden magic, effectively signing his death warrant. Vandred, Eric spoke. The name was not shouted. It was delivered in a low, vibrating rumble that caused the ancient stone floor beneath their feet to physically tremble. It was a death sentence spoken into existence. The Alpha King descended the 3 stone steps of the dais. He bypassed his sons, carefully, deliberately giving the boys a wide berth, completely terrified that his own volatile, feral aura might harm the children he had just found. He moved past them with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a looming avalanche, his tempestuous eyes locked entirely on the traitor. The air in his wake flash froze, turning the moisture in the breath of the courtiers into a fine mist of ice. Vandred staggered backward, his elegant slate-grey robes tangling clumsily around his trembling legs. "My king! Sovereign, you must listen. This is a trick. This is a deception. These children they are illusions. Dark magic crafted by the rival empire to break your mind." Illusions? Kaelin's small voice cut through the panic, dripping with a feral, mocking edge that sounded terrifyingly like his father. Before anyone could react, the younger twin raised his small hand. The microscopic trace of liquid gold on his knuckles flared into a blinding, searing arc of royal fire. Kaelin did not aim at the counselor. He aimed at the heavy oak table, where Vandred had placed his forged documents earlier. The golden magic struck the wood with a deafening crack, instantly incinerating the parchment into white ash, but leaving the wooden table entirely unharmed. It was a display of surgical, absolute magical control that no illusion or rival spy could ever replicate. It was the undisputed apex power of the supreme lineage. The court gasped, shrinking away from the terrifying child, the absolute reality of the royal heirs, finally crushing their political denial. Eric closed the remaining distance to Vandred in the blink of an eye. The king did not use his magic. He did not need to. He reached out with one massive, scarred hand and seized the senior counselor directly by the throat, lifting the grown man completely off the flagstones with terrifying ease. Vandred choked, his hands desperately clawing at the thick, iron-like forearm of the monarch. He kicked uselessly in the empty, freezing air. "You forged the ledgers," Eric snarled, his face inches from the counselor's terrified, bulging eyes. The ambient temperature around the king plummeted to absolute zero, the winterbane curse weaponizing his fury. Frost rapidly spread outward from his heavy boots, freezing the stone floor in jagged, spidery patterns of solid ice. "You manipulated the magical signatures. You used the pack laws to blind me, to force me to tear my own soul in half." "Sovereign, please." Vandred wheezed, his face turning a mottled, bruised purple as the oxygen was slowly crushed from his lungs. "You sent my mate into a blizzard," Eric continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper that echoed clearly in the dead, horrified silence of the hall. "You sent my unborn heirs out to freeze in the dark, so you could steal a crown that never belonged to your treacherous blood." The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hung heavy in the stifling air. The noble court, which had spent 5 years mocking the memory of the wolfless maid, was now forced to confront the apocalyptic reality of their own complicity. They had banished the only woman capable of carrying the true royal bloodline. They had nearly murdered the entire future of the Empire. "Guards!" Eric roared, his voice carrying enough kinetic force to shatter the remaining stained glass in the high Gothic windows, showering the edges of the room in glittering, colourful shards. A dozen heavily armoured royal guards, their eyes wide with fear, but their instinctual loyalty unquestionable, immediately surged forward from the shadows, their heavy iron halberds levelled at the councillor's retainers. The king threw Vandred to the ground. The senior councillor hit the freezing stone with a sickening, heavy crunch, gasping and coughing violently, thoroughly broken, his elegant robes stained with dirt and melting frost. "Tear away his titles," the Alpha King commanded, his exhausted gaze burning with absolute, unforgiving retribution, pointing a massive finger at the gasping traitor. "Sever him from his lands, his wealth, and his pack protection. Throw him in the deepest, darkest level of the dungeons. He will not see the sun again until I decide exactly how slowly he will die for his treason." The royal guards hauled the sputtering, weeping counsellor up by his arms, dragging him brutally toward the shattered oak doors. Vandred's panicked, pitiful pleas echoed down the long, freezing corridor before finally fading into the heavy, suffocating fog outside, leaving the courtroom purged of his toxic presence. The Grand Assembly was left in a state of absolute, terrified paralysis. The arrogant matriarchs were trembling uncontrollably. The lesser alphas had their heads bowed so low, their chins pressed against their chests, offering their throats in total submission. The entire political hierarchy of the capital, built on a foundation of lies and forged ledgers, had just been violently, permanently restructured by the arrival of two small children. Eric Sterling stood breathing heavily in the dead center of the hall, his massive chest rising and falling as the violent adrenaline of the physical confrontation slowly began to ebb. The blinding, murderous fury faded, leaving behind only the crushing, agonizing weight of his own profound guilt. He had executed justice, but he knew the brutal truth. Justice did not rewrite the past. The execution of a traitor did not erase the 5 years of isolation, fear, and freezing suffering his mate had endured alone. He remembered the sickening, physical snap of the severed mating mark on that dreadful day, how he had stood by and let her take all of the pain without a single word of comfort. He turned slowly, his heavy boots scraping against the frost-covered stone. He looked back toward the dais. Corin and Kaelin had not moved an inch. The twins watched him with stoic, unblinking intensity. Kenneth Vance stood a few paces behind them, leaning on his trusted cudgel, his amber eyes reflecting a profound, grim satisfaction. The Elder Guardian had brought the boys to the maw of the beast, and the beast had just broken its own teeth upon the truth. Eric took a hesitant, trembling step toward his sons. He, the most powerful wolf in the known world, the sovereign who had just shattered iron chains and ordered the ruin of his highest advisor without a second thought, was completely, utterly terrified of the tiny heirs standing before him. The crushing silence returned, heavy and suffocating. He stopped exactly 3 paces away. He slowly, deliberately lowered his massive frame, his joints popping slightly as he dropped heavily onto one knee upon the freezing flagstones. It was the ultimate, unquestionable gesture of submission. The Alpha King bowed his iron-crowned head, placing himself physically lower than the children he had unknowingly banished. "Your mother," Eric whispered, his voice cracking, thick with unshed tears and an absolute agonizing remorse that threatened to tear his heart in two. "Where is she?" Corin looked down at the kneeling monarch. The eldest twin did not offer a comforting, childish smile. He did not run into his father's massive arms. He possessed the exact, unflinching, straight-spined dignity of the woman who had raised him in the ice. "She is at the sanctuary," Corin answered quietly, clutching the territorial treaty tightly to his chest, the heavy iron seal clinking softly against his silver cloak. "But you cannot summon her here, Alpha King. The sovereign exile decree remains absolute. If you want her, you must go to the mountain." The silence that followed Corin's quiet declaration was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down upon the ancient flagstones of the grand courtroom. The eldest twin's words hung in the bitter air, an unbreakable edict delivered by a child who carried the indisputable authority of the bloodline. "If you want her, you must go to the mountain." Eric Sterling remained kneeling before his 5-year-old sons. The Alpha King did not argue. He did not issue a royal command or attempt to leverage the vast, terrifying military might of the sovereign's armies. His massive, broad shoulders slumped inward, completely defeated by the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of his own failure. For 5 years, he had allowed the heavy iron crown upon his head to dictate his reality. He had permitted forged ledgers and corrupt counselors to sever the sacred thread of his fated bond. He slowly lifted his hands, his scarred fingers, trembling violently against the harsh chill of the room, reached up to his brow. He gripped the jagged edges of the iron crown. The metal was biting, digging into his skin, a physical manifestation of the isolated, desolate winter he had built for himself. With a sudden, forceful motion, the monarch pulled the ancient symbol of his sovereignty from his head. He let it drop. The heavy band of dark metal struck the stone floor with a sharp, resonant clang that caused the surrounding nobles to flinch in visceral terror. It rolled a few inches before coming to a dead, unceremonious halt against the bottom step of the dais. The king was dead, only the mate remained. Eric pushed himself up from the floor, his towering frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the terrified court. He did not look at the cowering matriarchs or the trembling military commanders. He turned his silver-grey eyes toward Kenneth Vance. The elder guardian stood silently behind the twins, leaning on his carved wooden staff, his amber eyes completely unreadable. "Guard the heirs," the broken man rasped. His voice was raw, stripped of all regal cadence, sounding only like a desperate, starving animal. "Keep them safe within these walls until I return." Kenneth slowly bowed his head, a gesture of profound, hard-earned respect. "With my life." The sovereign turned his back on his throne. He walked down the wide central aisle of the cavernous hall, his heavy boots striking the stone with the relentless, unstoppable momentum of a looming avalanche. The wealthy lords and ladies practically climbed over each other to clear his path. Pressing their bodies flat against the cold stone pillars, absolutely terrified of the volatile, murderous aura radiating from his massive frame, he ignored them all. He reached the shattered oak doors and stepped out into the rime-covered, fog-drenched courtyard of the capital. The transformation was violently instantaneous. He did not possess the patience to shed his heavy cloak or unbuckle his armor. The human shell shattered, bones cracked and realigned in a brutal, explosive symphony of biological reshaping. Muscle mass expanded exponentially, tearing through the thick leather and dark wool of his royal garments. A deafening, guttural roar tore from his throat, shaking the frost from the high Gothic windows of the fortress. In mere seconds, a massive, terrifying shadow wolf stood in the center of the muddy courtyard. The beast was monstrous, a creature forged from midnight and ancient fury, its glowing storm-grey eyes burning with an intense, singular obsession. The wolf lunged forward. His massive paws struck the wet cobblestones, launching his body through the towering iron gates of the outer wall. Before the terrified guards could even register his movement, the beast hit the wide military road leading out of the capital and immediately broke into a dead, frantic sprint. The ascent toward the Whispering Peaks was not a journey. It was an act of brutal, physical penance. The wide, flattened roads of the lowlands rapidly they gave way to the treacherous, vertical switchbacks of the mountain range. The ambient temperature plummeted, the heavy, stagnant fog of the valley turning into a howling, razor-sharp blizzard that sought to flay the skin from his bones. The devastating generational curse that had been slowly chilling his blood for 5 years fought the wolf's desperate exertion. Spidery patterns of jagged ice crawled up his powerful forelegs, attempting to lock his joints and drag him down into the snow. The sub-zero environment was absolute agony. It burned through his thick black fur, sinking deep into his marrow. He refused to slow down. Every agonizing leap up the jagged incline was fueled by a crushing, soul-shattering empathy. As the howling wind battered his massive body, his frantic mind projected a horrifying, inescapable image against the whiteout. He saw her. He visualized the exiled queen, wrapped only in her heavy ancestral silver-furred cloak, walking this exact same lethal path 5 winters ago. She had been carrying his unborn sons. She had been vulnerable, entirely stripped of her pack protection, enduring the tearing, physiological agony of their severed mating mark while navigating this frozen hell alone. A low, whining whimper escaped the beast's jaws, instantly snatched away by the gale. The guilt was far worse than the glacial altitude. It was a suffocating, physical weight that crushed his lungs. His claws dug into the sheer, solid blue ice of the higher elevations, tearing his paw pads open. Vivid red droplets of sovereign blood stained the pristine white snow in his wake, but he did not feel the pain. He welcomed it. He demanded it. It was the absolute bare minimum of the suffering he owed the woman he had abandoned. Hours bled into a seamless, blinding blur of ice and exhaustion. By the time the massive shadow wolf reached the flat, frozen expanse of the mirror plateau, his breathing was a ragged, wet wheeze. He collapsed heavily onto his side, his muscles completely failing him under the sheer, impossible physical strain of the vertical sprint. He lay panting in the deep drift, his glowing eyes fluttering shut. The rime began to rapidly encase his fur. Then his highly attuned senses caught it. Beneath the overwhelming scent of falling snow and raw pine, he detected a faint, lingering trace of static ozone and burning gold. His sons had fought here. Their magical signature was permanently burned into the bedrock, and beneath that, faint, delicate, and fiercely resilient, was the scent of moonflower and cold iron. Her scent. The biological recognition hit his nervous system like a bolt of lightning. The severed, jagged scar on his collarbone flared with a blinding, phantom heat. The beast violently pushed itself back up from the snow, shaking the heavy frost from its dark coat. The fated bond, dormant and bleeding for half a decade, was pulling him forward with an irresistible, magnetic gravity. He crested the final, jagged ridge. The brutal, howling gales of the open mountain suddenly dampened, giving way to the heavy, suffocating stillness of the ancient, black pine forest. He had breached the borders of the high sanctuary. Through the dense, frost-covered trees, he saw it. A small, sturdy cabin built from raw mountain timber and dark stone nestled perfectly in the lee of a massive granite cliff. A thin, steady stream of grey smoke curled from the stone chimney, a beacon of defiant warmth in a world of absolute cold. The massive wolf slowed his frantic pace, creeping silently toward the edge of the tree line. His paws, raw and bleeding, made absolutely no sound against the deep powder. He stopped behind the thick trunk of an ancient pine, his broad chest heaving in erratic, shallow gasps. He saw her. Iris Vance was standing in the small clearing beside a heavy wooden chopping block. She was not a broken, weeping victim of his political failure. She was a monument of quiet, unyielding survival. She wore the heavy ancestral silver-furred cloak. The thick fabric pulled tightly around her shoulders to ward off the biting chill. Her dark hair was braided back, dusted with a fine layer of white snow. She held a heavy iron axe in her scarred hands, driving it down into a thick cedar log with a smooth, practiced, and entirely lethal efficiency. The simple, mundane rhythm of the wood splitting anchored the chaotic, violent storm inside his chest. The sharp crack of the metal parting the timber was the most beautiful sound he had heard in 5 years. Iris paused, lowering the axe. She wiped a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her leather glove. She turned her head, her sharp, perceptive gaze scanning the dark edge of the woods. The wind shifted, carrying the heavy metallic scent of sovereign blood and wet fur across the clearing. Iris didn't know the man watching her from the tree line was the Alpha King. She only saw a massive, broken creature bleeding into the snow, its dark shape entirely obscured by the heavy, falling shadows of the encroaching twilight. Her spine went perfectly rigid. Her hand tightened its grip on the iron handle of the axe, instantly preparing to defend her sanctuary against a feral predator. The beast stepped out from the cover of the pines. It did not bare its teeth. It did not emit the low, territorial rumble of an apex predator challenging a threat. Instead, the massive shadow wolf lowered its heavy head until its chin nearly scraped the snow. It tucked its tail in an absolute, unquestionable display of total biological submission, slowly limping into the pale light of the clearing. Iris stood perfectly still, her silver eyes narrowing. The heavy weapon in her hand did not waver. As the creature reached the center of the snowy yard, the dark fur began to recede. The bones cracked and reshaped in a rapid, agonizing reversal of the transformation. The beast dissolved, leaving the human man behind. Eric Sterling knelt in the glacial powder. He was stripped of all regal armor, wearing only the shredded, Bloody remains of his dark trousers, his broad, heavily scarred chest was completely exposed to the sub-zero expanse. The spidery, blue veins of the ancestral affliction were highly visible against his pale skin, aggressively spreading upward toward his throat as the environment sought to finally claim his life. He was shivering violently, his massive frame racked by uncontrollable, agonizing tremors. He looked up, his weathered gaze locked onto hers. The dead, desolate numbness that had consumed his soul for 5 years was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked, and utterly desperate vulnerability. Iris did not gasp. She did not drop the axe. The exiled queen maintained her flawless, straight-spined dignity, staring down at the most dangerous wolf in the Empire with an expression of profound, impenetrable calm. The ambient temperature in the clearing seemed to plunge even further, waiting for the final execution of the court's greatest mistake. "I was blind," Eric whispered. His voice was a shattered, guttural rasp, barely audible over the soft sigh of the falling snow. He did not attempt to stand. He kept his knees buried in the icy slurry, keeping his physical posture completely lower than hers. He deliberately left a wide, safe physical distance between them, exhibiting explicit, agonizing self-restraint so she would not feel threatened by his volatile presence. "You signed the parchment?" she stated. Her voice was perfectly steady, carrying the cold, uncompromising edge of a blade. "You sealed the sovereign exile decree. You banished me to the outer wilds, knowing I had no wolf to keep me warm. The laws of the capital dictate that if I cross your borders, my life is forfeit. The capital is dead to me," the broken monarch choked out, his broad chest heaving as he fought the paralyzing frost seeping into his lungs. "The council is broken. Vandred is in chains. I tore off the crown, Iris. I left it on the floor. I do not care about the borders. I do not care about the Empire. I only care about the absolute, unforgiving magnitude of what I did to you." Iris looked at the trembling, bleeding man kneeling in the snow. She saw the deep, jagged gouges on his bare skin, the physical toll of a frantic, suicidal sprint up a mountain that should have killed him. "You missed their first steps," the mother said softly, the words striking him with the brutal, kinetic force of a warhammer. "You missed the nights Corin burned with fever. You missed the days Kaelin could not control the fire in his blood. You chose the safety of your political throne over the truth of our bond, and you left me here to forge your heirs in the ice." "I know," Eric gasped, a single hot tear finally breaking free and instantly freezing against his sharp cheekbone. "I deserve the bitter cold. I deserve this generational curse. I deserve every agonizing second of the emptiness. But I cannot survive another night without you. I am a monster, Iris. I am a hollow, terrified coward who let the court whisper poison into his ears because he was too weak to trust his own soul." The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of 5 long, desperate winters. Iris did not offer a sudden, tearful forgiveness. She did not throw herself into his arms and pretend the blood on the snow had never been spilled. The trust had been brutally severed, and magic could not instantly wave away the profound, deep-rooted scars of her solitary survival. She slowly lowered the heavy iron axe, resting the blade against the wooden chopping block. "The ghost of a silenced past eventually returns to bite," Iris murmured, her silver eyes reflecting the glowing, amber light spilling from the cabin window. "And those teeth have bitten deeply into both of us. The boy you sent away is now a diplomat who can silence your entire court. The infant you abandoned is a storm that can burn your armies to ash. They do not need a sovereign to protect them. They need a father who knows how to bleed." Eric bowed his head completely, his forehead pressing against the rime-covered ground. "Let me bleed for them. Let me kneel at your door. I will not ask for your warmth. I will not demand the bond. Let me simply exist in your shadow to guard the sanctuary you built when I failed you." Iris looked down at the violently shivering man. The ancestral affliction was rapidly accelerating, the dark blue frost creeping past his collarbone, threatening to stop his heart entirely within minutes. The physical punishment he was inflicting upon himself was absolute. She took a single deliberate step forward. The soft crunch of her boot against the snow was the loudest sound in the clearing. I am no one's prize, neither conquered nor claimed, she stated, her voice dropping to a fierce, anchoring whisper. If you cross the threshold of my home, Eric Sterling, you do not enter as the Alpha King. You enter as the man I choose to let in. You leave the politics, the paranoia, and the Iron Crown buried in the snow. Do you understand me? Yes, he sobbed, the sound completely raw and devoid of all regal pride. Yes, whatever you command, only you. Iris reached down. She slowly pulled the thick leather glove from her right hand, exposing her bare, calloused, human skin. She did not hesitate. She pressed her warm palm directly against the frostbitten, jagged white scar on his left collarbone. The exact site of their severed mating mark. The biological reaction was explosive. The moment her skin made contact with the dead, frozen flesh, a blinding, searing wave of golden light erupted between them. The deep, latent royal gold magic hidden within her ancient, unrecognized bloodline flared to life, acting as a massive, physiological conduit. The intense, burning heat shot through Eric's failing nervous system, violently pushing back the lethal frost of the curse. He gasped, his storm-colored eyes flying wide open as the unbearable, agonizing cold in his veins was instantly incinerated by the heavy, anchoring warmth of a true fated bond knitting itself back together. The invisible, sacred thread that had been violently torn apart 5 years ago rewove itself in a matter of seconds, locking their souls into an absolute, harmonious resonance. The spidery ice on his chest melted into harmless water. The shivering stopped. Iris did not pull her hand away. She stood over him, acting as the undisputed anchor of his existence. The ambient temperature in the clearing miraculously softened, the harsh, biting gale dying down into a gentle, quiet snowfall. He slowly reached up, his massive, trembling hand carefully covering her smaller one, terrified that if he squeezed too hard, the illusion would shatter. But she was real. The heat was real. Come inside, the mother commanded quietly, her silver eyes finally softening with the first genuine trace of shared peace they had known in half a decade. The fire is dying, and your sons will be home soon. The heavy, Gothic stone of the great fortress would always stand as a monument to ancient bloodshed and political treachery, but the true throne of the empire was no longer located in the capital. The hollow house in the remote peaks still stands today, a quiet sanctuary hidden among the high pines. They say the winter there eventually broke, not because the seasons changed, but because a frozen king finally learned how to crawl, and a proud queen taught him how to live again without an iron crown. The ice always thaws eventually. If you felt the quiet warmth of this survival, please leave a comment with your thoughts, like this video, and subscribe to our sanctuary for more tales of shadows, redemption, and second chances.